Victoria Langford sat in the corner booth of Marcelli's restaurant on Christmas Eve, staring at the untouched plate of roasted duck before her. The dining room was nearly empty, just scattered couples finishing their meals and hurrying home to loved ones. She'd built an empire worth $3.7 billion, commanded boardrooms across 3 continents. But tonight she couldn't remember the last time someone had said Merry Christmas to her and meant it. Then the door chimed, and a man walked in with a young boy, counting coins in his weathered palm with an apologetic smile that would shatter her carefully constructed walls. What happened next would remind her of everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd lost, and give her one final chance to make it right. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The snow had started falling around 6 in the evening, soft flakes that caught the streetlights and turned Manhattan into something almost magical. Victoria watched through the restaurant window as families hurried past, bundled against the cold, their laughter muffled by the glass, but their joy unmistakable. She lifted her wine glass, a 20-year-old Bordeaux that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month, and took a slow sip. It tasted like ash in her mouth. She'd told herself this year would be different. She'd promised herself she wouldn't spend another holiday alone in a restaurant, pretending work emails required her immediate attention while couples shared desserts and children pressed their noses against frosted windows. But here she was again, 52 years old, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Armani suit, jewelry that could fund a small school, and absolutely no one to share the evening with. The waiter, Marco, had stopped asking if she was expecting company 3 years ago. Now he just brought her usual order, refreshed her wine, and left her to her solitude with the kind of professional discretion that came from working in establishments that catered to people who preferred to suffer in expensive silence. Victoria's phone buzzed on the white tablecloth, the screen illuminating with a message from her assistant. Another acquisition opportunity, a tech startup in Singapore that needed her decision by New Year's. She picked up the device, her thumb hovering over the notification, then set it face down without reading further. What was the point? Tomorrow she'd wake up in her penthouse overlooking Central Park, surrounded by art worth millions, furniture that had been featured in Architectural Digest, and a silence so complete it felt like drowning. She'd check her portfolio, watch her net worth tick upward with the opening markets, and feel absolutely nothing. It hadn't always been this way. Victoria could still remember being 25, hungry and ambitious, sleeping on her sister's couch while she built her first company from nothing. Back then she believed success meant freedom, meant security, meant never having to worry about keeping the lights on or stretching a paycheck across too many bills. She'd believed that once she made her first million, then her first 10 million, then her first 100 million, she'd finally feel safe enough to slow down, to build something that mattered beyond balance sheets and quarterly earnings. But the goalposts kept moving, and somewhere along the way she'd stopped noticing the people she'd left behind. Her sister hadn't spoken to her in 8 years. Her ex-husband had remarried, had 2 children, sent her a Christmas card every year with a photo of his new family that she read once, and then filed away in a drawer she never opened. Her college friends had stopped inviting her to reunions after she'd canceled on the 5th one in a row. The door to the restaurant opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and the sound of sleigh bells that Marco had hung above the entrance in a fit of seasonal enthusiasm. Victoria glanced up, expecting another couple, and instead saw a man and a young boy standing just inside the doorway, both of them covered in snow and looking uncertain. The man was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair that needed a trim and a winter coat that had seen better days, patches visible at the elbows and a zipper that didn't quite close properly. The boy beside him couldn't have been more than 7, wearing a red knit hat with a pom-pom on top and mittens connected by a string that ran through his sleeves. They both had the same warm brown eyes, the same slight cleft in their chins, clearly father and son. Marco approached them with menus, but the man shook his head, speaking in a low voice that Victoria couldn't quite hear. She watched as he pulled out a small change purse, the kind that closed with a metal clasp, and began counting coins onto his palm. Quarters, dimes, nickels, the boy watching with wide eyes as his father sorted through the contents. Marco leaned in, listening, then nodded and gestured toward a table near the window, far from Victoria's corner booth, but still within her line of sight. The man's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he guided his son toward the table with a gentle hand on the boy's back. Victoria found herself watching them as they settled into their seats, the boy climbing onto the chair with help from his father, both of them removing their winter layers with the practiced efficiency of people used to doing for themselves. The man hung the boy's coat on the back of the chair, smoothed down his son's hair where static had made it stand up, then sat down himself with a tired sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. Marco brought them water, said something that made the boy giggle, then disappeared into the kitchen. The man opened a menu, angling it so his son could see, and Victoria watched as they studied it together, the father's finger moving down the page while the boy pointed at various items with excitement. She saw the exact moment the man's expression changed, saw him glance at the prices, and then quickly close the menu with a forced smile. He leaned close to his son, whispering something that made the boy's enthusiasm dim slightly, but not disappear. Whatever the father had said, the boy nodded seriously, like they were sharing an important secret. When Marco returned with his notepad, ready to take their order, Victoria strained to hear the conversation. The father ordered a single plate of spaghetti carbonara, the least expensive entree on the menu, and 2 glasses of milk. Marco wrote it down without comment, but Victoria saw his eyes flick between the father and son, saw him hesitate before asking if they wanted anything else. The man shook his head with that same apologetic smile, and Marco retreated to the kitchen once more. Victoria knew she should look away, should return her attention to her own meal, her own thoughts, her own carefully constructed isolation. But something about the pair held her gaze. The boy was chattering now, animated despite the modest order, his small hands gesturing as he told his father some elaborate story that involved dragons and knights and a magic sword. The father listened with complete attention, laughing in all the right places, asking questions that made the boy's face light up even brighter. There was a threadbare quality to their clothes, a worn-down exhaustion around the father's eyes. But there was also something else, something Victoria recognized from a lifetime ago when she'd been that hungry, that tired, that determined to make the world seem full of possibility even when your bank account said otherwise. Her duck had gone cold on the plate, the vegetables glazed and unappetizing. Victoria pushed it away and took another sip of wine, the alcohol warming her chest but doing nothing for the strange ache that had settled beneath her ribs. She thought about her own Christmases as a child, back when her father was still alive and money was always tight, but never seemed to matter much. She remembered the year he'd lost his job at the factory, how he and her mother had scraped together enough for a small tree and a handful of presents wrapped in newspaper comics. She'd been maybe 6, her sister 4, and they'd thought it was the best Christmas ever because their parents had been there, fully present, making hot chocolate from packets and teaching them to sing carols off-key. When had she forgotten that? When had success become synonymous with isolation, with measuring worth in portfolio returns rather than moments shared? Victoria knew the answer, had known it for years but refused to examine it too closely. Her marriage had fallen apart the same year her hedge fund broke $1 billion in assets under management. She'd missed her nephew's birth because of a merger in Tokyo. She'd skipped her father's funeral because of a crisis at the London office that, in retrospect, her team could have handled without her. Every choice had made perfect logical sense at the time, but the sum of those choices had led her here, to this corner booth, alone on Christmas Eve, watching strangers share a single plate of pasta and feeling envious of their poverty. Marco emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate piled with spaghetti, steam rising from the pasta in delicate curls. He set it in front of the father with a flourish, then produced 2 smaller plates and silverware, arranging everything with care. The boy's eyes went wide at the portion size, and Victoria watched as the father carefully divided the pasta between the 2 plates, giving the larger portion to his son despite the boy's protests. They said grace together, the boy folding his small hands while his father bowed his head, their lips moving in silent prayer before they picked up their forks. The way they ate told Victoria everything she needed to know. The father took small bites, savoring each one like it might be his last, while encouraging his son to eat more, to have all the bread from the basket Marco had brought, to drink his milk because growing boys needed calcium. The boy ate with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of childhood, twirling pasta onto his fork with mixed success, tomato sauce accumulating at the corners of his mouth, until his father reached across with a napkin and gently wiped it away. They talked between bites, the boy's stories punctuated by his father's questions and observations, both of them treating this simple meal like it was a feast at the finest restaurant in the world. Victoria's chest tightened watching them. She thought about calling her sister, about trying once more to bridge the gap that had grown between them, but what would she even say? Sorry I missed your daughter's graduation because I was closing a deal in Dubai? Sorry I forgot your birthday 3 years running because I was too busy making money I didn't need and couldn't spend in 10 lifetimes? The truth was that Victoria had become exactly what she'd once despised. Someone who confused the price of everything with the value of nothing, who could quote market trends and economic indicators, but couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed until her stomach hurt. Marco approached their table with dessert menus, but the father waved them away with a shake of his head, reaching for his change purse once more. Victoria watched as he counted out the exact amount for the bill, adding coins carefully until he had the right sum, then leaving a modest tip that was probably more than he could afford. The boy looked disappointed, his eyes lingering on the dessert display case near the front of the restaurant where a chocolate cake stood like a beacon of everything they couldn't have. The father noticed, saw his son's longing, and for a moment his expression crumpled into something raw and painful before he composed himself and reached for his son's hand. Hey, buddy, the father said, his voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. How about we play a game on the way home? We'll count snowflakes, see if we can get to 1,000 before we reach our building. Winner gets to pick the movie we watch tonight. The boy's disappointment transformed into excitement immediately. Can we watch the one about the race cars again? Absolutely, the father said, standing and helping his son into his coat, his movements practiced and efficient. We'll make popcorn too, the fancy kind with butter. Real butter? The boy asked, his eyes wide with wonder at this promised luxury. Real butter, his father confirmed, zipping the coat and pulling the red hat down over his son's ears. And we'll have hot chocolate after, with marshmallows. Victoria felt something break inside her chest as she watched them prepare to leave. This man, this stranger with his threadbare coat and his change purse, was giving his son everything that mattered while having almost nothing to give. He was turning their poverty into an adventure, their limitations into games, their simple meal into a memory his son would treasure. Meanwhile, Victoria sat in her corner with her expensive wine and her cold duck and her billions of dollars, and couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at her the way that boy looked at his father, with complete trust and uncomplicated love. The boy glanced around the restaurant one last time before they left, and his eyes landed on Victoria. For a moment they just looked at each other, this child bundled in his patched coat, and this woman wrapped in cashmere and pearls. Then the boy smiled, a gap-toothed grin that transformed his whole face, and waved at her with his mitten-covered hand. Victoria raised her hand automatically, waving back, and felt her eyes begin to burn with tears she hadn't shed in years. Dad, the boy said, tugging on his father's hand and pointing at Victoria, that lady is sitting all alone. Can we say Merry Christmas to her? The father followed his son's gesture, meeting Victoria's eyes across the restaurant. She saw surprise there, and something else, recognition maybe, though they'd never met before. It was the kind of recognition that came from understanding loneliness when you saw it, even wrapped in expensive clothes and seated in fancy restaurants. He seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to approach or respect her privacy, but his son made the decision for him, tugging insistently until the father relented and guided him toward Victoria's booth. They stopped a respectful distance away, the boy looking up at her with those earnest brown eyes while his father stood slightly behind him, one hand on his son's shoulder. Victoria set down her wine glass and straightened in her seat, suddenly conscious of how she must look, polished and perfect, and utterly alone. Merry Christmas, the boy said, his voice clear and sincere. You shouldn't be sad on Christmas. It's supposed to be happy. Victoria opened her mouth to respond, to offer some polite deflection, but the words wouldn't come. She looked at this child, this sweet boy who'd just shared a single plate of pasta with his father and still had room in his heart to worry about a stranger, and felt something in her chest crack wide open. Thank you, she managed, her voice rougher than she'd intended. Merry Christmas to you too. The boy glanced back at his father, who nodded encouragingly, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small wrapped candy, the kind given away at checkout counters in grocery stores. He held it out to Victoria with both hands, like he was offering something precious. "This is for you," he said. "Everyone should have a treat on Christmas." Victoria stared at the candy, at this child's small hands in their worn mittens, at the generosity being offered by someone who had so little to give. Her vision blurred, tears finally spilling over despite her best efforts to contain them. She reached out and accepted the candy, her fingers trembling as she took it from his hands. "This is very kind of you," she whispered. "What's your name?" "Noah," the boy said proudly. "Noah Keller. And this is my dad, Andrew." "I'm Victoria," she said, looking up at Andrew Keller, seeing him properly for the first time. He had the kind of face that had been handsome before exhaustion had carved lines around his eyes and mouth, before worry had created a permanent crease between his eyebrows. But his eyes were kind, genuinely kind, and when he smiled at his son there was nothing but pure love in his expression. "I'm sorry if we disturbed you," Andrew said, his voice warm despite the apology. "Noah has a habit of making friends wherever we go." "You didn't disturb me," Victoria assured them, wiping at her eyes with more composure than she felt. "You've actually made my evening much better." Noah beamed at this, clearly pleased with himself, and Victoria found herself smiling back, a real smile that felt strange and wonderful on her face. She looked at the candy in her hand, at this tiny gift that somehow meant more than anything she'd received in years, and made a decision that would have shocked her business associates. "Would you both like to join me for dessert?" she asked, gesturing to the empty seats in her booth. "The chocolate cake here is supposed to be excellent." Noah's eyes went wide, and he looked up at his father with barely contained excitement. Andrew hesitated, pride and desire warring on his face, and Victoria recognized that look too, the way you weighed accepting help against maintaining dignity. She'd worn that expression herself once, back before she'd built her empire, back when accepting meant acknowledging you needed help, and acknowledging need felt like admitting defeat. "Please," Victoria added, keeping her voice gentle. "I have more dessert than I could possibly eat alone, and it seems a shame to waste it on Christmas." Andrew looked at his son, at Noah's hopeful expression, and something in him seemed to surrender. "That's very generous of you," he said finally. "If you're sure we wouldn't be imposing." "I'm sure," Victoria said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. She flagged down Marco, who appeared with his usual efficiency, eyebrows slightly raised at the change in her evening. "Could we please have your chocolate cake, the large one from the display case, and 3 plates? And 3 hot chocolates with whipped cream." Marco's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine warmth in his smile. "Of course, Miss Langford. Right away." Andrew helped Noah out of his coat again, and they slid into the booth across from Victoria, the boy bouncing slightly with excitement while his father settled in more carefully, still seeming uncertain about accepting this kindness. Victoria found herself studying them more closely now, noticing details she'd missed before. Andrew's hands were work-roughened, the kind of calluses that came from manual labor rather than tennis or golf. His watch was a basic Timex, the band worn but clean. His shirt, visible now that he'd removed his coat, had been mended at the collar, the stitching careful but visible. These were people who took care of what they had because replacing things wasn't an option. "So, Noah," Victoria said, focusing on the boy because that felt safer than examining her own motivations too closely. "Your dad mentioned watching movies and making popcorn. What's your favorite movie?" Noah launched into an enthusiastic description of an animated film about race cars that Victoria vaguely remembered seeing advertised, his hands gesturing wildly as he explained the plot and the characters and why the blue car was the best one even though everyone thought the red car would win. Andrew watched his son with the kind of attention that spoke of practice, nodding in all the right places, adding details when Noah forgot them. Clearly having seen this movie dozens of times and never tiring of his son's passion for it. Marco returned with the cake, a towering confection of dark chocolate layers separated by raspberry cream, topped with chocolate shavings and fresh berries. He set it in the center of the table with a flourish, along with 3 dessert plates and 3 mugs of hot chocolate crowned with mountains of whipped cream. Noah gasped audibly, his eyes reflecting the candlelight that Marco had added to the table, making everything look magical and special. "Thank you, Marco," Victoria said, and the waiter nodded before retreating to give them privacy. They served the cake in comfortable silence, Andrew cutting modest portions while Noah watched the process with reverent attention. When everyone had their slice, Victoria raised her mug of hot chocolate in a toast. "To new friends," she said, "and to Christmas miracles." Andrew and Noah clinked their mugs against hers, and they all took their first bites of cake. Noah made a sound of pure delight, chocolate coating his lips as he savored the dessert like it was the finest thing he'd ever tasted. Andrew ate more slowly, his expression showing appreciation but also something else, a kind of bittersweet awareness that this was a temporary luxury, a moment outside their normal reality. "This is the best Christmas ever," Noah declared around a mouthful of cake, and Andrew gently reminded him not to talk with his mouth full. Though his correction was softened by the smile he couldn't quite hide. Victoria watched them, father and son, sharing this simple pleasure, and felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the hot chocolate. She asked Noah about school, about his friends, about what he'd asked Santa for this year, and the boy answered with the kind of honesty that children possess before the world teaches them to guard their words. He wanted art supplies, he told her, because he liked drawing pictures of spaceships and dinosaurs. He wanted new shoes because his were getting too small, and they pinched his toes. He wanted his dad to not look so tired all the time. That last one hit Victoria like a punch to the gut. She glanced at Andrew, saw him swallow hard, and reach over to ruffle his son's hair with affection that didn't quite mask the pain in his eyes. "Don't worry about me, buddy," Andrew said softly. "I'm doing just fine." But he wasn't fine. Victoria could see that clearly now. This was a man running on fumes, held together by love for his son and sheer determination, working himself to exhaustion, trying to provide the kind of life he dreamed of giving. She recognized the look because she'd seen it in her own mirror once, back before success had come, back when she'd been fighting just to survive and prove herself worthy of existing in spaces that didn't want her. The difference was that Victoria had been fighting for herself, driven by ambition and fear and a burning need to never be powerless again. Andrew was fighting for his son, for Noah's future, for the chance to give this child every opportunity and experience he deserved. There was something both heartbreaking and beautiful about that distinction, and Victoria found herself wanting to know their story, to understand how they'd ended up counting coins on Christmas Eve and turning scarcity into games. But she didn't ask. Some stories needed time to be shared, needed trust to be built first. Instead, she steered the conversation to lighter topics, asking about their neighborhood, about Noah's favorite subjects in school, about the best places to see Christmas lights in the city. They talked easily, the initial awkwardness fading as the evening stretched on and the restaurant grew emptier, until it was just the three of them and Marco tidying up in the background, giving them space but remaining attentive. When the cake was finished and the hot chocolate mugs were empty, Noah yawned hugely, his eyelids drooping despite his best efforts to stay awake. Andrew checked his watch, a gesture that seemed automatic, and Victoria saw concern flash across his face. "We should get going," he said reluctantly. "It's getting late, and someone has a big day tomorrow." Noah perked up at this, clearly remembering whatever Christmas plans they had made, and began wrestling himself back into his coat with his father's help. Victoria felt a sharp pang of regret that the evening was ending, that these people who'd been strangers an hour ago were about to walk back out into the cold and disappear from her life. She stood as they prepared to leave, smoothing down her suit jacket, trying to think of something to say that wouldn't sound desperate or strange. "Thank you," Andrew said, meeting her eyes directly. "This was really special. You didn't have to do this, but I'm grateful you did." "I should be thanking you," Victoria replied, and meant it. "You both reminded me of something important tonight." Noah, bundled up and ready to face the cold, stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Victoria's waist in a quick, fierce hug. She froze for a moment, shocked by the unexpected contact, then slowly brought her hands up to rest on his shoulders, returning the embrace with a gentleness that felt rusty from disuse. When he pulled back, he was smiling up at her with uncomplicated affection. "You're not sad anymore," he observed with the blunt wisdom of children. "That's good." Victoria crouched down so she was at his level, ignoring the expensive fabric of her suit and the cold floor beneath her knees. "You're right," she said softly. "I'm not sad anymore, thanks to you." They left then, father and son walking hand in hand toward the door, Marco holding it open for them with a knowing smile. Victoria watched through the window as they stepped out into the falling snow, saw Andrew point up at the sky, already starting their game of counting snowflakes. Noah jumped and spun, trying to catch flakes on his tongue, while his father laughed and pretended to count, both of them heading down the street toward whatever modest apartment awaited them. Victoria returned to her booth, but she didn't sit down. Instead, she stood there looking at the empty mugs and plates, at the crumbs of chocolate cake and the small wrapped candy Noah had given her, still sitting on the white tablecloth. She picked up the candy, turning it over in her fingers, this tiny gift that had cost nothing and meant everything. Then she looked at Marco, who was approaching with her bill, and made another decision that would have shocked her business associates. "Marco," she said, her voice steady, "I need to know something. That man who just left, Andrew Keller. He paid with coins. Do you know anything about him?" Marco hesitated, loyalty to all his customers warring with concern on his face. "I shouldn't really talk about other patrons, Miss Langford. I'm not asking you to gossip," Victoria said gently. "I'm asking because I want to help, but I need to do it right. I need to do it in a way that respects their dignity." Something in her tone must have convinced him, because Marco's expression softened. He glanced toward the door where Andrew and Noah had disappeared, then back at Victoria. "He comes in maybe once every few months," Marco said quietly. "Always on special occasions, always with his son. Always orders the least expensive thing on the menu. I've tried to comp their meals before, but he refuses, always insists on paying full price. Pride, I guess, or maybe principle. He's a good father, anyone can see that. But yeah, things look pretty tight for them." Victoria nodded, processing this information. "Thank you for telling me. And Marco, I'm going to leave something extra with tonight's payment. If they come back, I want you to use it to cover their meals, but don't tell them. Tell them there's a special discount, or it's a slow night, whatever you need to say. Just make sure they can eat without worrying about the cost." Marco's professional composure cracked into a genuine smile. "That's very kind of you, Miss Langford. I'll make sure it happens." Victoria paid her bill, leaving a tip that would have covered a week's worth of meals, plus a substantial amount for Andrew and Noah's future visits. Then she gathered her coat and purse, pausing one last time to look at the booth where they'd all sat together, where for a brief hour she'd felt connected to something real and meaningful. The candy went into her purse, precious cargo she'd keep close, a reminder of the evening when a child's kindness had broken through walls she'd spent decades building. The snow was falling heavier now as Victoria stepped out into the night, her driver waiting at the curb with the engine running to keep warm. She slid into the back seat of the Mercedes, the heated leather immediately enveloping her in comfort, and gave instructions to be taken home. As they pulled away from the restaurant, she caught a glimpse of two figures in the distance, a tall man and a small boy holding hands as they walked through the snow, the boy jumping to catch snowflakes while his father counted aloud, both of them laughing. Victoria watched them until they disappeared from view, something stirring in her chest that felt almost like hope. She thought about her empty penthouse, her silent Christmas morning, the loneliness she'd chosen through 1,000 small decisions that had seemed rational at the time. Then she thought about Andrew Keller, counting coins to buy his son dinner, but making it feel like a feast. She thought about Noah, giving away his one piece of candy to cheer up a stranger. She thought about the way they'd looked at each other, the unspoken language of love that needed no translation. That night, Victoria couldn't sleep. She lay in her king-sized bed, surrounded by Egyptian cotton sheets and down pillows, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom and replaying the evening over and over. The candy Noah had given her sat on her nightstand, still wrapped, a tiny thing that somehow felt more valuable than all the expensive gifts she'd received over the years. At 3 a.m, she got up and went to her study, pulling out her laptop and opening a private browser window. She started searching, using the resources available to someone with her wealth and connections. Andrew Keller, single father, New York City. It took some time, required calling in favors from people who specialized in discreet information gathering. But by dawn, Victoria had a clearer picture of the man and boy who'd stumbled into her Christmas Eve. Andrew's wife, Sarah, had died 2 years ago from complications related to pneumonia. They'd had no insurance beyond the bare minimum, and the medical bills had wiped out their modest savings and left Andrew with debt that would take years to clear. He worked 2 jobs, one as a maintenance technician at an office building downtown, another doing night shifts at a warehouse in Queens. Noah was in second grade at a public school in the Bronx, doing well academically despite the challenges at home. They lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in a building that had multiple violations for heat and plumbing issues. Andrew's credit score was poor, not because he didn't pay his bills, but because he'd been forced to prioritize which bills got paid each month, juggling debts like a circus performer keeping plates spinning. The information made Victoria's chest ache with recognition. This could have been her story so easily. If her first business hadn't succeeded, if she hadn't caught that one break that led to another and another, she could have been Andrew, working herself to death and still falling short. The only difference was luck, timing, and the arbitrary cruelty of circumstance. Victoria spent Christmas morning alone, as planned, but her mind was elsewhere. She thought about Andrew and Noah, imagined them in their small apartment, making the most of whatever modest celebration they'd managed to arrange. She thought about Noah opening his few presents, about Andrew watching with love and guilt warring on his face, wishing he could give more. She thought about all the Christmases she'd wasted, the relationships she'd neglected, the moments she'd traded for money that sat in accounts earning interest she'd never spent. For the first time and longer than she could remember, Victoria felt something other than the numbing emptiness that had become her constant companion. She felt angry, but not at Andrew or Noah, or even at herself. She felt angry at a world that let good people struggle while others hoarded more wealth than they could use in 10 lifetimes. She felt angry that a child like Noah had to give up his only piece of candy to cheer a stranger, that a father like Andrew had to apologize for ordering one meal to share. She felt angry that she'd let herself become complicit in that system, building wealth while remaining blind to the human cost of that accumulation. But more than anger, Victoria felt something else stirring, something that had been dormant for so long she'd barely recognized it. She felt purpose. She felt the possibility of making amends, not just to Andrew and Noah but to herself, to the person she'd been before ambition had consumed everything else. She thought about her sister's words from their last conversation, years ago now, before the final falling out. "You've become someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing," her sister had said. "And someday you're going to wake up and realize that all your money can't buy back the years you wasted chasing it." Victoria had dismissed those words at the time, written them off as jealousy or misunderstanding. But sitting in her penthouse on Christmas morning, looking out at the city stretched below her like a kingdom she'd conquered but never really belonged to, she understood what her sister had meant. She'd won at capitalism and lost at being human. She'd accumulated power and possessions while letting atrophy every skill that actually mattered, the ability to connect, to love, to be vulnerable, to see other people as something more than abstractions or obstacles or opportunities. The candy sat on her coffee table now, catching the winter sunlight that streamed through her floor-to-ceiling windows. Victoria picked it up, unwrapped it slowly, and placed the small piece of peppermint on her tongue. It tasted sweet and sharp, nothing special, the kind of candy you could buy 100 of for a few dollars. But it meant more to her than caviar or champagne or any of the expensive things she consumed without really tasting. This candy represented a moment when someone who had nothing had chosen to give what little they had to ease another's loneliness. It represented the kind of grace that existed outside balance sheets and market analyses, the currency of kindness that Victoria had forgotten how to spend. She made more calls that day, to lawyers and accountants and the kinds of specialists who arranged complex financial maneuvers for wealthy clients. She spent hours on the phone, working through the logistics of what she wanted to do, making sure every detail was handled correctly. By evening, when the city lights began to twinkle like stars below her window, Victoria had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't solve everything, but it was a start. It was a way to help that respected dignity while providing real support, that created opportunity without creating dependency. The days between Christmas and New Year passed in a blur of activity. Victoria had her team gather information about Andrew's situation, his debts, his landlord, his employment, all done discreetly through layers of legal protection that ensured his privacy. She learned that he'd been late on rent 3 times in the past 6 months, that his apartment's heat had been out for 2 weeks in November, that he'd been picking up extra shifts at the warehouse despite already working 70 hours a week. She learned that Noah's school had provided free lunches because Andrew qualified for assistance, though he'd resisted signing up until a kind teacher had convinced him it was about Noah's needs, not his pride. She learned that Andrew had been trying to save for community college classes, wanting to get certified as an HVAC technician, which would mean better pay and more stable hours. But every time he got close to having enough saved, some emergency would drain the account. Noah's shoes wearing out, the check engine light coming on in their aging Honda, a copay at the doctor when Noah had strep throat, the grinding poverty that trapped people not through laziness or poor choices, but through the brutal mathematics of insufficient income versus unavoidable expenses. Victoria found herself thinking about them constantly, this father and son who'd wandered into her Christmas Eve loneliness and reminded her what actually mattered. She thought about Noah's gap-toothed smile, his complete trust in his father's love despite their circumstances. She thought about Andrew's tired eyes and careful hands, the way he divided that pasta to make sure his son ate more. She thought about the games they played to make hardship feel like adventure, the way they'd counted snowflakes like it was the most important task in the world. On December 30th, Victoria made her move. She had her lawyers purchase the building where Andrew and Noah lived, a transaction so complex and routed through so many corporate entities that tracking it back to her would have required resources most people didn't possess. The building was a wreck, 17 units housing families who deserved better, owned by an absentee landlord who'd been collecting rent while ignoring basic maintenance. Victoria's team immediately brought in contractors to handle the most urgent repairs, heat and plumbing and electrical issues that had been reported and ignored for months. The tenants were told the building had new ownership committed to proper maintenance, nothing more. Then Victoria had her people reach out to Andrew's employers, both of them. She arranged, through more corporate intermediaries, for his maintenance position downtown to come with a substantial raise and benefits, framed as part of a company-wide compensation review. The warehouse job, she arranged for him to be offered a daytime supervisor position that paid better and had regular hours. No more overnight shifts that left him exhausted and unable to spend time with his son. Both offers were presented as recognition of his excellent work performance, opportunities he'd earned through his reliability and skill. For Noah's school, Victoria made a donation large enough to fund art supplies for the entire district, new computers for the library, and a scholarship fund for students pursuing creative fields. All done through a foundation that bore no trace of her personal involvement, just another wealthy donor doing good works. But she made sure Noah's teacher knew there were art supplies available, that students interested in drawing and creativity would be supported. The medical debt from Sarah's illness, that crushing weight Andrew had been carrying for 2 years, Victoria had that handled too. She had her people approach the collection agencies, negotiate settlements for pennies on the dollar, then pay them off in full. Andrew would receive letters in the mail explaining that his debt had been satisfied as part of a hospital forgiveness program, a bureaucratic explanation that he'd have no reason to question. His credit score would begin to repair, the constant calls from collectors would stop, and he'd be able to breathe without that particular stone pressing on his chest. Victoria knew she was playing God in some sense, manipulating circumstances from behind a curtain of anonymity and wealth. She knew there was something problematic about swooping in to solve problems that existed because of systemic failures she'd profited from her entire career. But she also knew that philosophizing about the ethics of charity versus justice didn't put food on anyone's table or heat in anyone's apartment. She could work on the bigger problems, and she would, but right now she wanted to help these specific people who'd shown her kindness when she'd needed it most. On New Year's Eve, Victoria did something she hadn't done in years. She left her penthouse without a destination, without a plan, just wrapped herself in a coat that cost more than most people's monthly rent and walked out into the city. She found herself heading toward the Bronx, toward the neighborhood where Andrew and Noah lived, not with any intention of revealing herself, but just wanting to see with her own eyes that they were okay. She found their building easily enough, the address burned into her memory from the background reports. It looked better already, scaffolding up on one side where contractors had been working on the facade, new windows being installed to replace the drafty old ones. Victoria stood across the street in the falling snow, watching the lit windows, imagining the lives being lived behind them. Families getting ready for New Year's celebrations, children playing, people who worked hard and deserved better than they'd been getting. Then she saw them. Andrew and Noah emerged from the building's entrance, both bundled against the cold, Noah wearing new shoes that fit properly and a warmer coat than the patched one she remembered. They were laughing about something, Noah skipping beside his father while Andrew held his hand, both of them heading toward the corner store, probably to pick up something for dinner. They looked lighter somehow, less burdened, though Victoria knew the real changes wouldn't become fully apparent for a while yet. She watched them disappear into the store, then made herself turn away, heading back toward her own neighborhood before they could emerge and potentially recognize her. This wasn't about gratitude or recognition. This was about doing something right for once, about using her resources to make a tangible difference in lives that mattered. If they never knew she was behind it, that was fine. Better, even. The help would be more meaningful if it seemed to come from luck or karma or just the universe evening out, rather than charity from a wealthy stranger. The new year arrived with fireworks and celebrations across the city. Victoria watched from her penthouse balcony, champagne growing warm in her hand while the sky lit up with colors. She thought about resolutions, about the promises people made to themselves when one year became another. For years, her resolutions had been about business goals, acquisition targets, percentage growth, and portfolio value. This year, standing alone in the cold with the sound of celebration echoing up from the streets below, Victoria made different promises. She promised to remember what Noah and Andrew had taught her, that wealth meant nothing if it existed separate from human connection. She promised to use her resources for more than accumulation, to find ways to create opportunity for people trapped by circumstance. She promised to try, however awkwardly, to rebuild relationships she'd let atrophy, starting with her sister. She promised to be present in her life rather than just successful in her career. Most importantly, she promised not to forget the look in Noah's eyes when he'd offered her that candy, the pure generosity that existed despite having so little to give. That was the kind of person Victoria wanted to become again, someone who could give freely, who could connect without agenda, who understood that the most valuable currency wasn't in banks but in moments shared and kindness offered. January brought cold that settled into the city's bones and refused to leave. Victoria kept track of Andrew and Noah from a distance, through the reports that came back from her various initiatives. Andrew had accepted both job offers, had quit the overnight warehouse shift, was working regular hours, and actually sleeping more than 4 hours a night. His performance reviews were excellent, his supervisors noting his reliability and skill, recommending him for additional training opportunities. The medical debt collectors had stopped calling, and he'd started saving money again, this time without emergencies immediately draining the account. Victoria found herself reading these updates with an intensity that surprised her. She'd sit in her home office late at night, reviewing the weekly reports like they were the most important business documents she'd ever examined. She learned that Andrew had started volunteering at Noah's school, helping with maintenance work that the underfunded institution desperately needed. The principal had written a glowing note about his contributions, how he'd fixed the heaters in 3 classrooms without being asked, how he'd repaired playground equipment on his own time, how the students gravitated toward him because he always had a kind word and seemed genuinely interested in their lives. She learned that Andrew had taken Noah to a museum for the first time, a free admission day at the Natural History Museum, and that Noah had talked about the dinosaurs for weeks afterward. The school art teacher mentioned in her notes that Noah's drawings had shifted after that visit, becoming more detailed and ambitious, incorporating what he'd learned into elaborate scenes of prehistoric life. Victoria found herself smiling at these details, imagining Andrew and Noah standing in front of the towering skeletons, both of them looking up in wonder, making memories that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with time spent together. She also learned about setbacks, smaller ones now, but real nonetheless. Andrew's car had broken down in February, the transmission finally giving out after years of neglected maintenance. Victoria had watched from afar as he'd navigated that crisis, selling the car for scrap and switching to public transportation rather than taking on new debt. It meant longer commutes, meant standing in the cold waiting for buses, but it also meant freedom from monthly payments and expensive repairs. Andrew had turned it into another adventure for Noah, teaching him about subway maps and bus schedules, turning their commutes into geography lessons about the city they called home. Noah was thriving too, his teacher reporting that he'd taken to the new art supplies with enthusiasm, creating elaborate drawings that showed real talent. He'd made friends with other kids in the after-school art program that Victoria's donation had funded, was laughing more, seemed less worried about his father. The school counselor noted that he appeared more secure, less anxious, though she attributed this to normal childhood development rather than any external changes in circumstances. Victoria started visiting Noah's school occasionally, always carefully arranged through her foundation contacts, always framed as a general donor visit rather than interest in any specific student. She'd walk through hallways decorated with children's artwork, past classrooms where teachers worked miracles with insufficient resources, and she'd feel both proud of the help she was providing and ashamed that such help was necessary in the first place. Education shouldn't depend on wealthy donors feeling charitable. Healthcare shouldn't bankrupt families. Housing shouldn't consume 70% of working people's income. But philosophizing about systemic problems didn't help anyone right now. So Victoria focused on what she could change directly, while also beginning to support policy initiatives that might address root causes. Victoria found herself checking these reports obsessively, looking for evidence that her intervention was helping without causing harm. She worried sometimes that she'd overstepped, that there was something arrogant about assuming she knew what people needed. But then she'd remember Andrew counting coins, Noah offering his candy, the exhaustion in a good man's eyes, and she'd know that regardless of philosophical concerns, concrete help was better than abstract hand-wringing. She also started making changes in her own life, slowly at first, but with gathering momentum. She reached out to her sister, a tentative email that turned into a phone call that turned into plans to meet for coffee. The first meeting was awkward, years of distance and hurt feelings sitting between them like a wall, but they kept trying, kept showing up, kept choosing connection over comfort. It would take time to rebuild what had been broken, but Victoria was learning that worthwhile things usually did. The coffee shop where they met was nothing like the places Victoria usually frequented. It was a small neighborhood spot in Queens, near where her sister lived, with mismatched furniture and a chalkboard menu and prices that didn't require a second mortgage. Victoria felt out of place in her designer clothes, aware of the way other patrons glanced at her with curiosity or suspicion. But her sister, Jennifer, had insisted on meeting on her own turf, and Victoria understood why. This was about Jennifer's comfort, about creating space where they could talk as equals rather than billionaire and civilian. Jennifer looked older than Victoria remembered, though only 2 years separated them. Her hair was going gray at the temples, and she had laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a life lived fully despite having less money. She wore jeans and a sweater that had seen better days, practical shoes that prioritized comfort over fashion. When Victoria slid into the seat across from her, Jennifer's expression was guarded, defensive, the look of someone who'd been hurt and wasn't ready to forget just because enough time had passed. "Thank you for meeting me," Victoria said, and heard how formal she sounded, how stilted. She tried again. "I've missed you. Have you?" Jennifer's voice was careful, not hostile, but not warm either. "Or have you missed the idea of having a sister while being too busy to actually be one?" The words stung because they were true. Victoria had missed holidays, birthdays, important moments, always with excellent excuses, but never with real attempts to make amends. "Both, I think," she admitted. "But mostly I've missed you. The real you, not just the concept." They talked for 2 hours that first meeting, cautiously at first, and then with growing honesty. Jennifer told her about her life, her job as a social worker, her husband who taught elementary school, her daughter who was applying to colleges and stressed about financial aid. Victoria listened without trying to fix anything, without offering money or solutions, just listening the way she should have been doing for years. When Jennifer cried talking about their father's funeral, about Victoria's absence and the hurt that had caused, Victoria cried too, apologizing without making excuses, acknowledging the pain she'd caused through neglect and misplaced priorities. "I can't change the past," Victoria said as their coffee grew cold and the afternoon light began to fade. "But I want to be better going forward. I want to be the sister you deserve, not the sister I've been." Jennifer studied her for a long moment, searching Victoria's face for sincerity or manipulation. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because her expression softened slightly. "I'd like that," she said. "But it has to be real, Vicky. Not just you feeling guilty or trying to check a box." If you're going to be in our lives, you need to actually be present. Victoria had nodded, had promised, and had kept showing up. They met weekly for coffee, then extended it to dinners. Then Victoria was invited to family game nights and her niece's choir concert. She got to know Jennifer's husband, discovered he was funny and kind and perfect for her sister. She got to know her niece, a smart girl who wanted to study environmental science and change the world. Victoria found herself looking forward to these gatherings, found that she enjoyed being Aunt Vicky more than she'd ever enjoyed being a powerful executive. One evening, at a family dinner in Jennifer's modest apartment, Victoria watched her sister and brother-in-law cooking together in their small kitchen, laughing about some private joke, moving around each other with the practiced ease of long partnership. She watched her niece doing homework at the dining table, occasionally asking for help and receiving it with patience and encouragement. She looked at the worn furniture, the photos on the walls, the general clutter of lives being lived fully, and felt a pang of envy so sharp it took her breath away. This is what she'd given up. This warmth, this connection, this sense of belonging to something larger than herself. She'd traded it for penthouses and private jets and the kind of wealth that meant never having to worry about money, but always feeling empty inside. The trade had seemed logical at the time, success for sacrifice, but sitting there in her sister's apartment eating homemade lasagna and listening to her niece talk about a science project, Victoria understood what a terrible bargain she'd made. She restructured her investment portfolio, moving money out of certain holdings she'd started to see as ethically problematic and into funds that focused on social impact alongside financial returns. She took board positions with organizations working on affordable housing, healthcare access, education equity. She discovered that she actually enjoyed using her business acumen for something beyond enriching herself, that there was satisfaction in solving problems that helped real people rather than just shareholders. And she kept an eye on Andrew and Noah, always from a distance, never revealing her involvement. She watched as Andrew enrolled in those community college classes he'd been dreaming about, as Noah's artwork got displayed at a school show, as their lives slowly stabilized in ways that must have seemed like miraculous good fortune to them. Victoria knew she couldn't take credit for their strength or resilience or love for each other. Those things had existed before she'd interfered. All she'd done was remove some obstacles, create some breathing room, give them the space to thrive that they deserved all along. In February, Victoria attended Noah's school art show, carefully timing her visit to avoid running into Andrew. She walked through the gymnasium, where student artwork hung on temporary walls, stopping to admire each piece with genuine interest. She found Noah's contribution easily, a large drawing depicting a father and son walking through falling snow, the figures small but detailed, the snowflakes each individually rendered. The title card read, "Winter Adventure," and the description, written in Noah's careful printing, explained that it showed him and his dad counting snowflakes on the way home from dinner. Victoria stood in front of that drawing for a long time, remembering the night Noah had been depicting, the evening she'd watched them leave the restaurant and head out into the snow. She thought about how that same night had marked a turning point in her own life, how a child's kindness had cracked open something in her chest that she'd thought was sealed forever. Other visitors to the show bumped past her, parents and teachers exclaiming over various pieces, but Victoria barely noticed. She was lost in memory, in the realization that small moments could echo forward in ways no one anticipated, that kindness rippled out in directions impossible to predict. A woman approached, introducing herself as Noah's art teacher, asking if Victoria had a connection to the student. Victoria had to think quickly, settling on the truth filtered through omission. "I met Noah and his father once," she said. "They made quite an impression on me." The teacher smiled warmly. "Noah's very special. He has real talent, but more than that, he has heart. You can see it in his work. Every piece tells a story about love or family or finding joy in simple things. He's going to do wonderful things someday." Victoria agreed, purchasing Noah's drawing through the silent auction that was raising money for the art program, bidding high enough that no one else could compete. She wanted that piece, wanted to hang it somewhere she'd see it every day, a reminder of what actually mattered. When the teacher expressed surprise at the amount, Victoria simply said the work was worth it, that investing in young artists was important. She arranged for the drawing to be professionally framed and delivered to her penthouse, where it would take pride of place in her study, more valuable to her than any of the expensive art pieces she'd collected over the years. Spring arrived slowly, winter reluctant to release its grip on the city. Victoria found herself taking walks through different neighborhoods, seeing New York through new eyes. She noticed the people she'd been trained to overlook, the maintenance workers and street vendors and delivery drivers who made the city function. She started really looking at them, seeing the exhaustion and determination and dignity in faces she'd been walking past for decades. She began supporting businesses in working-class neighborhoods, became a regular at Jennifer's favorite coffee shop, started shopping at the local grocery store near Andrew and Noah's building instead of having everything delivered from expensive specialty shops. These small changes felt revolutionary to Victoria, like learning to speak a language she'd once known but had forgotten. She discovered she enjoyed the rhythm of neighborhood life, the way the barista remembered her order, the way other shoppers smiled and made small talk while waiting in line. This was the fabric of community that existed below her previous altitude, the human connections that money insulated you from if you let it. Victoria was learning not to let it, learning to be present in her own life rather than floating above it in a bubble of wealth and isolation. In March, Victoria found herself back at Marcelli's restaurant, sitting in the same corner booth where she'd spent Christmas Eve. She'd been coming back occasionally, partly because the food was excellent and partly because the place held meaning now, represented a turning point in her life. Marco always greeted her warmly, though he maintained the professional discretion that made him excellent at his job. He never mentioned Andrew and Noah, though Victoria knew they'd been back several times, always on special occasions, always ordering with more confidence now though never wastefully. She was halfway through her meal when the door chimed and she looked up to see them walk in, father and son holding hands, both of them looking healthier and happier than they had in December. Noah had grown slightly, was wearing clothes that fit properly, had color in his cheeks that spoke of better nutrition and less stress. Andrew looked transformed, the exhaustion gone from his eyes, his shoulders straight rather than slumped, his smile reaching his eyes when he looked at his son. Victoria felt her heart rate increase as Marco seated them at a table near her booth, close enough that she could hear their conversation if she focused. Part of her wanted to look away, to give them privacy, but she couldn't help watching as they studied the menus, couldn't help noticing that this time Andrew didn't flinch at the prices, that Noah was allowed to order what he actually wanted rather than what they could afford. They ordered pasta and salad and bread, a proper meal rather than something to split. They talked easily while waiting for the food, Noah telling an elaborate story about something that had happened at school, Andrew listening with the same complete attention he'd shown in December. They looked like a family that had turned a corner, that was moving from survival to actually living, and Victoria felt a fierce pride that she'd played some small part in that transformation. Then Noah looked up and saw her. His face lit up with recognition and delight, and before Andrew could stop him, he was sliding out of his seat and heading toward her booth with all the confidence of a child who'd been taught to trust his instincts about people. Victoria's breath caught as he approached, suddenly nervous in a way that business negotiations never made her, uncertain how to handle this moment. "Miss Victoria," Noah said when he reached her table, his voice bright with excitement. "I remember you. You shared cake with us on Christmas." Andrew had followed his son, one hand on Noah's shoulder, looking apologetic for the interruption. "Noah, we shouldn't disturb Miss." He paused, clearly trying to remember her name. "Langford," Victoria supplied, standing automatically, suddenly aware of the social awkwardness of the situation. "Victoria Langford. And please, he's not disturbing me at all. I'm so glad to see you both again." Andrew's eyes widened slightly at her name, and Victoria wondered if he'd made the connection, if he'd heard of her in financial news or business circles. But his expression remained friendly, no hint of the calculation or agenda that usually appeared when people realized who she was. "We wanted to thank you," he said simply. "What you did that night, inviting us to share dessert, it meant a lot to both of us." "It meant a lot to me too," Victoria said honestly. "More than you know." Noah was looking between them with the astute observation of children, sensing there was more to this conversation than the surface words. "Are you still sad?" he asked Victoria directly, with the blunt concern that made him so endearing. Victoria crouched down so she was at his level, ignoring her expensive suit and the restaurant floor for the second time in 3 months. "No," she said softly, meeting his eyes. "I'm not sad anymore. Things have gotten better since Christmas." "Me too," Noah said happily. "Lots of good things have been happening. Dad got new jobs that pay more, and our apartment has heat now, and I got to join art class at school. It's like magic." Victoria's chest tightened, hearing him attribute these changes to magic, to random luck rather than deliberate intervention. She glanced up at Andrew, saw gratitude and wonder in his expression, the look of a man whose prayers had been answered without understanding how. "That's wonderful," she managed. "You both deserve good things. Would you like to join us?" Andrew asked, the invitation spontaneous and genuine. "We're celebrating. Noah got an A on his science project, and it would be nice to have company." Victoria hesitated, knowing she should decline, knowing there was something complicated about accepting this offer when she knew things about their lives that they didn't know she knew. But she also wanted desperately to say yes, to sit with them again, to be part of their celebration, even tangentially. "I'd love to," she heard herself say, and Andrew's smile told her she'd made the right choice. They moved to Andrew's table, Victoria bringing her wine glass and what remained of her meal. Marco appeared with additional place settings and menus, a subtle smile on his face that suggested he approved of this development. They ordered more food, Victoria insisting on picking up the check over Andrew's protests, framing it as her way of celebrating Noah's achievement. Over dinner, Victoria learned more about their lives in the months since Christmas. Andrew talked about his new positions, how the better pay and hours meant he could actually spend time with Noah, could help with homework and take him to the park rather than always being either working or sleeping. He talked about the community college classes, how learning HVAC systems made him feel like he was building towards something rather than just treading water. He talked about small victories that seemed huge in context, paying bills on time, having money for groceries without choosing between them and rent, being able to buy Noah new shoes when he needed them rather than making the old ones last dangerously past their usable life. Noah talked about art class, about his friends, about the drawings he was making and the contest his teacher said he should enter. He talked with the enthusiasm of a child who felt secure enough to dream, who believed good things were possible because good things kept happening. Victoria listened to both of them with an attention she usually reserved for business presentations, but this mattered more than any deal she'd ever made. "I don't know what we did to deserve this change in luck," Andrew said at one point, his voice soft with wonder. "It feels like everything started getting better all at once, like someone was looking out for us." Victoria took a sip of her wine to hide her expression, uncertain how to respond. She settled on, "Sometimes good people catch breaks. Sometimes the universe balances things out." "Maybe," Andrew said, looking at his son with undisguised love. "Or maybe we just needed to hold on long enough for things to shift. Either way, I'm grateful. This is the most hopeful I've felt since Sarah died." The mention of his late wife hung in the air for a moment, acknowledged but not dwelled upon. Victoria didn't pry, didn't ask questions, just nodded to show she understood that grief was part of their story but not the whole story. They ate dessert again, Marco bringing chocolate cake without being asked, clearly remembering their Christmas order. Noah declared it even better than he remembered, and Andrew laughed, relaxed in a way that transformed his whole face. When the evening finally ended and they prepared to leave, Noah gave Victoria another hug, this one less surprising, but no less meaningful. Andrew shook her hand, his grip firm and warm. "Thank you again," he said, "for tonight and for Christmas Eve. You've been kind to us, and I won't forget that." Victoria wanted to tell him the truth, wanted to explain that she'd done so much more than share a couple meals, but she kept silent. The help was more valuable when it seemed to come from fortune rather than charity. "Take care of each other," she said instead. "And maybe I'll see you both here again sometime." "We'd like that," Andrew said, and seemed to mean it. Victoria watched them leave, watched through the window as they walked down the street, Noah skipping while his father held his hand. She felt lighter than she had in years, felt connected to something real and important. When Marco brought her bill, she added another substantial tip and instructions that any time the Kellers came in, their meal should be treated as already paid for, a permanent standing arrangement disguised as a frequent customer discount. "You're doing a good thing," Marco said quietly, abandoning his professional distance for just a moment. "They're good people who needed a break. They gave me something too," Victoria replied. They reminded me how to be human. Over the following months, Victoria's life continued to transform. She sold off several of her holdings, donating the proceeds to organizations working on poverty relief and economic justice. She restructured her companies to prioritize worker welfare and sustainable practices, accepting slightly lower profit margins in exchange for knowing people weren't being exploited in her name. She reconnected with old friends, made new ones, started saying yes to social invitations that weren't about networking or deal-making. She ran into Andrew and Noah occasionally, at the restaurant or around the city, and each time they greeted her with warmth that felt genuine rather than transactional. She watched Noah grow, watched his confidence bloom, saw artwork he was creating that showed real promise. She watched Andrew's stress lines fade, watched him stand taller, heard about his successful completion of HVAC certification and his promotion to a senior technician position that came with stability and respect. She never told them the truth about her involvement in their changed circumstances. Let them believe in magic, in cosmic luck, in karma rewarding good people. The help was no less real for being anonymous, and their pride was no less intact for not knowing it had come from someone specific rather than random chance. A year after that first Christmas Eve meeting, Victoria found herself back at Marcelli's on December 24th. She'd told Marco she wanted the same booth, wanted to mark the anniversary of the night that had changed her life. She sat there with her wine and her duck, watching the snow fall outside, thinking about the woman she'd been a year ago and the woman she was becoming. The door chimed at 8 o'clock, and Victoria looked up to see Andrew and Noah walk in. They were dressed nicely, Noah in a button-down shirt and Andrew in a tie, both of them glowing with health and happiness. They looked around the restaurant, and when Noah spotted Victoria, his whole face lit up. They came directly to her booth without hesitation this time, and Victoria found herself standing to greet them with a smile that felt natural and unforced. "Merry Christmas, Miss Victoria," Noah said, and this time he had a small wrapped gift in his hands, offered with ceremony. "We got you something. Dad said it was important to thank people who've been kind to us." Victoria accepted the gift with hands that shook slightly, overwhelmed by the gesture. She unwrapped it carefully to find a drawing, Noah's work, showing 3 people sitting at a table sharing cake, their faces simple but recognizable. Her, Andrew, and Noah, frozen in a moment of connection that had mattered to all of them. "It's beautiful," Victoria whispered, meaning it. "This is the best gift I've ever received. Would you like to join us for dinner?" Andrew asked. "We'd love to have you celebrate with us if you're free." Victoria looked at them, at this father and son who'd stumbled into her life and reminded her what actually mattered, who'd given her back her humanity without even knowing what they'd done. She thought about her empty penthouse, her successful career, her billions of dollars, and realized none of it meant anything compared to this moment, this invitation, this chance to be part of something real. "I'd love that," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. They sat together in the booth, the 3 of them, and ordered a feast. They laughed and talked and shared stories, building memories rather than just marking time. Victoria watched Andrew and Noah, watched the love between them that no amount of money could buy and no tragedy could fully diminish. She thought about the woman she'd been, alone and bitter on Christmas Eve, and the woman she was becoming, someone who understood that wealth meant nothing if it existed separate from connection. As the evening stretched on and the restaurant began to empty, Noah yawned and leaned against his father's shoulder, content and tired. Andrew wrapped an arm around his son, holding him close, and looked across the table at Victoria with an expression that held gratitude and something else, a recognition perhaps of shared understanding. "Thank you for being part of our lives," Andrew said quietly. "You've made these past months brighter." Victoria felt tears prick her eyes but didn't try to hide them. "Thank you for letting me in," she replied. "You've given me more than you'll ever know." And it was true. Noah and Andrew had given her back herself, had shown her that it was never too late to change, to choose connection over isolation, to use wealth as a tool for good rather than just a score to keep. They'd taught her that kindness mattered more than power, that love was the only currency that actually increased when you spent it, that sometimes the most important gifts came wrapped in modest paper from people who had almost nothing to give. Victoria thought about the journey that had brought her here, From that empty corner booth a year ago to this moment of genuine connection. She thought about all the years she'd wasted chasing success that left her hollow, all the relationships she'd sacrificed for accomplishments that meant nothing in the end. She thought about her sister's words, about knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing, and understood how close she'd come to spending her entire life in that empty state. But Andrew and Noah had saved her, though they didn't know it. A simple act of kindness from a child who had every reason to keep his one piece of candy for himself. A father's dignity in poverty, his determination to give his son experiences and joy despite having almost nothing to give. Their love for each other, uncomplicated and fierce, had shown Victoria what she'd been missing, had reminded her that being human meant being vulnerable, meant opening your heart even when it hurt, meant choosing connection over control. She looked at Noah now, sleeping peacefully against his father's shoulder, his small face relaxed and content. She looked at Andrew, who watched his son with an expression of such pure love it made her chest ache. These were her people now, her family in the way that mattered, not connected by blood but by choice, by shared moments, by the understanding that they'd saved each other in ways both big and small. As Victoria watched Noah sleep against his father's shoulder, as she listened to Andrew talk about their plans for the future with hope rather than fear, she understood something fundamental had shifted in her life. She'd spent decades building an empire, accumulating wealth and power and influence, believing that success would eventually fill the emptiness inside her. But one Christmas Eve, a single father and his son had walked into a restaurant counting coins, and in their simple kindness and unshakable love, they'd shown her what she'd been missing all along. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the city in white, making everything look clean and new and full of possibility. Victoria raised her glass in a silent toast to second chances, to unexpected connections, to the grace that came from opening your heart even when, especially when, you'd forgotten how. She'd been a billionaire sitting alone on Christmas Eve, convinced she had everything and feeling like she had nothing. Now she was a woman sitting with friends, learning that sometimes the smallest gestures, a shared meal, a piece of candy, a child's drawing, mattered more than all the money in the world. And that was the real magic of Christmas, the real gift that couldn't be bought or sold or accumulated in a portfolio. It was the understanding that we save each other, that kindness ripples out in ways we can't always see, that love given freely multiplies beyond measure. Victoria had learned that lesson from a 7-year-old boy and his struggling father, and she would spend the rest of her life honoring what they'd taught her, one small act of grace at a time.